4:52 p.m., Coastal Industrial Yard. The salt wind is biting. Employees gather around the manager's glass-walled office. Jack Miller, 43, a single dad, worn-out safety vest. His employee ID hangs loosely from his calloused hand. The director points a finger. "You're fired, right now." A few colleagues turn away. Others watch with cold curiosity. Jack doesn't argue. He doesn't explain. He places his ID badge on the desk and turns to leave. Mocking laughter erupts behind him. Jack takes 10 steps toward the gate. Suddenly, a low rhythmic thumping shakes the sea air. The ground begins to vibrate. 2 Navy helicopters appear, descending directly into the shipyard. Jack Miller had worked at the Coastal Engineering Yard for 7 long years, becoming a fixture of the facility like the rusted cranes and the salt-stained docks. To most of the 300 employees, he was just the quiet guy in the worn-out navy blue vest, a shadow moving through the early morning fog. His job was categorized as basic maintenance and safety oversight, a title that sounded much less important than the work he actually performed. While others gossiped over coffee, Jack was the one who could tell a pump was failing just by the frequency of its vibration, or know a bolt was loose by the way the wind whistled through a scaffold. He didn't just see the machines, he felt their pulse, understanding the language of steel and steam in a way that modern sensors often missed. No one at the yard knew about the metals tucked away in a velvet-lined box at the back of his closet, nor the commendations signed by admirals. Jack had buried that life. He was a single father, and his primary mission in life wasn't the security of the fleet anymore. It was the safety and happiness of his 10-year-old son, Noah. After his wife, Elena, passed away following a grueling 3-year battle with cancer, Jack had realized that time was the only currency that mattered. He traded his high-stakes military career for a predictable, low-stress job that allowed him to be at the school gates by 3:30 p.m. every afternoon. To Jack, being a dad was the most elite rank he had ever held. He remembered the nights spent on the deck of a carrier, staring at the stars and missing Elena, and he vowed never to miss a moment of Noah's life. The change at the yard began 6 months ago when a private equity firm bought the facility. They brought in a new management team led by Director Sterling, a man who wore suits that cost more than Jack's truck and viewed engineering through the narrow lens of a spreadsheet. Sterling cared about optimization, lean output, and aggressive KPIs. He saw Jack's meticulous safety checks not as essential security, but as a bottleneck to production. The veteran workers respected Jack, but the new, younger hires, eager to please the boss, saw Jack's quiet nature as a sign of obsolescence. They mistook his stillness for a lack of ambition, unaware that he was simply a man who had seen enough chaos to value the peace of a job done correctly. They whispered that he was a slow-motion relic in a high-speed world. On this particular Tuesday morning, Jack noticed a subtle deviation in the telemetry data of the secondary cooling system for the coastal pump house. It was a phantom signal, a 0.5% pressure drop that shouldn't have been there. It was the same ghost pulse he had seen on a nuclear-powered carrier a decade ago, right before a catastrophic failure of the main turbine. Jack didn't hesitate. He walked straight to the director's office. He laid out the data, his voice steady and devoid of ego. "The secondary seals are cavitating, sir. We need to shut down for a full inspection. If that seal breaches, the salt water will corrode the main housing within hours." Sterling didn't even look up from his monitor. "Jack, the quarterly report is due in 48 hours. A shutdown now costs us $500,000 in delayed deliverables. Is anything broken right now?" Jack paused, choosing his words with the precision of a technician. "Not yet, but the physics are inevitable. The vibration signature—" Sterling cut him off with a dismissive wave. "The vibration signature isn't a KPI, Jack. Go back to your station. Stick to the manual and stop trying to play engineer. You're a maintenance tech. Know your place." Sterling's tone was ice, a sharp reminder of the new hierarchy where data was king and instinct was garbage. Jack walked back, the salt air stinging his face. He felt the familiar weight of silence. He could have shouted. He could have pulled his credentials and explained that he had managed systems 10 times more complex than this entire yard. But he had learned long ago that people like Sterling only listened to the sound of things breaking. He went back to his station, documented his warning in the logbook, and watched the pressure gauges. He wasn't doing it out of spite, he was doing it out of duty. He watched the needle on the analog gauge shiver, a tiny mechanical sob that predicted the coming storm. By 4 p.m., the physics Jack had predicted began to manifest. A low-frequency hum began to resonate through the concrete floor of the main workshop. The younger techs looked around, confused, but Sterling, panicked by the sudden drop in output, needed someone to blame. He didn't want to admit he had ignored a warning. He needed a sacrifice to explain the delay to the board. He marched out onto the floor, followed by his sycophants, and headed straight for Jack's station. The confrontation was public and brutal. Sterling didn't just fire Jack. He tried to dismantle him. "Your negligence has caused a critical delay in our production cycle," Sterling shouted, his voice echoing off the corrugated metal walls. "You were assigned to monitor these pumps, and you failed. You're incompetent, Jack. You're a relic who can't keep up with modern standards." The crowd grew silent. The veteran workers looked down, too afraid of their own jobs to speak up. Jack stood there, his employee ID in his hand, looking at Sterling not with anger, but with a profound, chilling pity. Jack didn't say a word. He didn't point to the logbook. He didn't remind Sterling of the morning's warning. He simply unclipped his badge. To Jack, this wasn't about the job anymore. It was about the environment. If the leadership was willing to compromise safety for a spreadsheet, it was no longer a place where a man of his character belonged. He felt the sting of the humiliation, but he also felt a strange, sudden lightness. He was free of the noise. His only concern was that he was now 8 minutes late to pick up Noah. The walk to the main gate felt like a mile. Jack carried his small toolbox in one hand and his helmet in the other. Behind him, the yard was a hive of frantic activity. Alarms were beginning to blare. The minor glitch was becoming a major malfunction. Steam hissed from a relief valve near the pump house. But the management was too busy arguing over who was at fault to actually fix the problem. Jack passed his desk one last time, picking up a framed photo of Noah and Elena. The glass was slightly dusty, but Elena's smile remained as bright as the day it was taken. At the gate, a group of younger technicians was gathered near the smoking area. One of them, a man named Tyler, who had always been vocal about Jack's slow methods, let out a loud theatrical whistle. "Hey, Jack, heading out early? Guess the manual was too hard to read today." Tyler laughed, looking to his friends for approval. "Maybe you can find a job at a car wash. I hear they don't have vibration signatures there." Jack didn't break his stride. He didn't even blink. He had been insulted by experts in war zones. Tyler's words were like pebbles thrown at a tank. He only felt a slight sadness that these young men didn't yet understand that arrogance is the first stage of a catastrophic failure. Jack reached the security turnstile. The guard, an old man named Bill, who had shared many quiet night shifts with Jack, looked at the floor, unable to meet his eyes. "I'm sorry, Jack. I heard what happened on the radio. It ain't right." Jack offered a small, sad smile. "It's okay, Bill. Take care of yourself." Bill hit the release and the gate clicked open with a metallic finality. Jack stepped onto the gravel lot outside the perimeter fence. Behind him, the gate hissed shut, and he heard the heavy mechanical lock engage. He was officially an outsider, a ghost in the machinery he had tended for years. He pulled his phone from his pocket. He had 12 missed calls and 24 text messages. All of them were from encrypted military numbers. He ignored them. He had one message that mattered, a text from Noah's teacher saying they were doing an extracurricular art project and Noah was waiting in the lobby. Jack's heart tightened. He had failed the yard's KPIs, but he was failing the only KPI that mattered right now, his son's time. He fumbled with his keys, his hands slightly shaking from the adrenaline of the exit. As he reached his old Ford F-150, the air around the shipyard changed. The wind, which usually blew steadily from the east, suddenly swirled and died. Then the sound began. It wasn't the screech of the failing pumps inside the yard. It was something much deeper, a visceral, bone-shaking frequency that Jack knew in his marrow. It was the sound of twin-engine turbines screaming at high torque, pushing through the dense, salty air. The sky seemed to bruise, turning a dark, military gray as the clouds were torn apart. The director Sterling had come out to the parking lot to speak with a contractor, still fuming from the shutdown. He saw Jack standing by his truck and started toward him, likely to deliver one last insult about trespassing on the lot. But as he opened his mouth, the sound drowned him out. The concrete beneath their feet began to thrum. The puddles in the gravel lot began to dance with concentric ripples, reflecting a power that no spreadsheet could quantify. Two gray silhouettes broke through the low-hanging coastal clouds. They weren't civilian rescue birds. These were MH-60R Seahawk Navy helicopters, fully kitted for maritime operations. They didn't circle for a landing pad. They hovered, their downwash blasting the gravel lot, sending Sterling's expensive suit jacket fluttering wildly and knocking over a stack of empty crates. The sheer power of the machines was terrifying to the onlookers who had poured out of the shipyard to see what was happening. Jack didn't run. He didn't hide. He stood by the open door of his truck, squinting against the dust and the spray. He watched the helicopters tilt their rotors, banking with a grace that only elite pilots could command. He saw the Navy markings, the hull numbers he recognized, in the specialized sensor pods. He knew this wasn't a drill. Something had gone catastrophically wrong out at sea, and the ghost was being summoned back from the shadows. He felt the old call of duty stirring in his chest, a sharp contrast to the mundane humiliation he had just endured. The director was shouting something, waving his arms at the helicopters as if he could command them to leave his property. He looked like a frantic ant trying to stop a storm. Jack ignored him, his eyes locked on the lead bird as it began its final descent into the clearing. The unidentified incident wasn't in the shipyard. The shipyard was just the closest landing zone to the man they needed. Sterling stood there, a small man in a large suit, dwarfed by the reality of real-world stakes. The helicopters touched down with a heavy, pressurized thump, their rotors continuing to spin in a hot idle state. The side door of the lead Seahawk slid open, and a Navy captain in flight gear jumped out, followed by two armed shore sailors. They ignored the crowd of stunned shipyard workers. They ignored Sterling, who was trying to push his way through the dust to demand an explanation for the unauthorized landing. The captain scanned the parking lot, his eyes bypassing everyone until they landed on the man in the worn-out vest standing by the old truck. He marched straight toward Jack. The crowd watched, breathless, expecting the military to arrest the fired tech. Instead, as the captain reached Jack, he stopped, stood perfectly at attention, and delivered a razor-sharp salute that cut through the lingering dust. "Senior Chief Miller," the captain shouted over the roar of the engines. "We have a catastrophic thermal runaway on the USS Gerald R. Ford's secondary desalination array. The salt conversion logic has crashed, and the core is overheating. Every engineer we have says it's a total loss, but the Admiral said there's one man who's seen this feedback loop before." The revelation hit the crowd like a shockwave. The low-level tech wasn't just a maintenance man. He was a senior chief, the highest enlisted rank in the Navy, and a legendary specialist in maritime thermal systems. The director, Sterling, had turned a ghostly shade of white. He was standing close enough to hear every word. He looked at Jack, then at the captain, then back at Jack. The man he had just called incompetent was the person the United States Navy turned to when their multi-billion-dollar supercarriers were in danger of melting down. The irony was so thick it was almost audible. Jack didn't look at Sterling. He didn't look at the colleagues who had laughed at him. He looked at the captain. "The Ford, that's the new digital throttle system. It shouldn't have a runaway unless the bypass valves were manually overridden during a software patch." The captain's eyes widened. "That's exactly what happened, Senior. How did you know?" Jack gave a grim nod. "Because I wrote the manual on that system before I retired. I told them the software patch had a logic flaw." He had spent years predicting failures. Today, two of them had come true at once. Sterling, unable to contain his confusion, blurted out, "Why didn't you tell us? If you're a senior chief, why were you working as a grease monkey in my yard?" Jack finally looked at him. The gaze was cold, empty of malice but full of weight. I didn't come here to be a senior chief, Mr. Sterling. I came here to be a father. I didn't tell you who I was because in my world, your title doesn't save lives. Your eyes and your ears do. I warned you about the pumps this morning because I saw the failure, not because I wanted a promotion. You chose to ignore the warning because you didn't like the man giving it. He paused, letting the words sink into the silent crowd. Engineering isn't about hierarchy, it's about the truth. And the truth doesn't care about your suit. Jack's silence wasn't a lack of pride. It was the ultimate form of it. He believed that a professional should be judged by the quality of their current work, not the glory of their past. He had watched Sterling make decisions based on ego and rank for 6 months, and he had stayed silent to see if the director would ever value the truth over the spreadsheet. Sterling had failed the test. Jack had given him every opportunity to be a leader, and Sterling had chosen to be a manager instead. The captain checked his watch. "Senior, we have 18 minutes before the array goes critical. We need you on that bird." Jack looked at his truck, then at the shipyard gate where Noah's school was just a few miles away. This was the moment he had dreaded, the mission calling him away from his son. But he also knew that if the Ford's array failed, it wasn't just a carrier at risk, it was the lives of 5,000 sailors. The weight of his oath was still there, pulling at him. He made a decision. He turned to the captain. "I'll go, but I need a secure line to my son's school. I need to tell him I'm going to be late, and I need a car sent to pick him up and take him to his grandmother's. I won't leave him waiting in a lobby." The captain nodded immediately. "Already done, Senior. We have a team en route to the school now. They'll stay with him until your mother-in-law arrives. We don't leave family behind." As Jack climbed into the helicopter, he looked back at Sterling one last time. "The pumps in your yard are going to fail in about 20 minutes, Mr. Sterling. The saltwater breach I warned you about is already through the primary seal. If you want to save your facility, I suggest you stop looking at your spreadsheet and start looking at the pressure gauges in Section B. But then again, you're the director. You probably already know that." He strapped himself in, the familiar vibration of the bird soothing his nerves as the doors slid shut on the stunned audience. Sornanoam. The Seahawk took off with a roar, the downwash nearly knocking Sterling to his knees. As the helicopters disappeared into the clouds, the shipyard was left in a state of absolute chaotic silence. The power dynamic had flipped so violently that the management team looked like they were suffering from vertigo. The board of directors, who had been listening to the confrontation over the yard's open mic system, were already on the phone. They hadn't just heard a firing, they had heard the death knell of their current leadership style. Within 5 minutes, the incompetent tech's termination was not only suspended, but replaced by a formal investigation into Director Sterling's management. The Navy had officially designated the shipyard a critical support zone for the duration of the emergency, which meant Sterling no longer had any authority. A Navy liaison officer remained on site, and his first order was to implement exactly what Jack had suggested that morning, a total shutdown and seal replacement of the coastal pumps. The yard's siren began to wail, but this time it was a signal of correction, not just disaster. Jack, meanwhile, was 3,000 feet above the Atlantic, patched into the Ford's engine room via a satellite link. He wasn't there in person, but his voice was the only one that mattered. He guided the carrier's young ensigns through a series of manual overrides that bypassed the glitched software. He was calm, his voice a steady anchor for the panicked crew on the ship. "Listen to the hum of the intake, son," Jack told the young man on the other end. "If it pitches up, you're venting too much pressure. Keep it steady. You're doing fine." He felt a sense of purpose he hadn't realized he missed, but it was tempered by the knowledge that Noah was waiting. Back at the shipyard, the workers who had mocked Jack were now the ones being interrogated by the board. Tyler, the tech who had teased Jack about a car wash, was forced to admit that Jack had warned him about the vibration days ago. The mocking laughter had turned into a thick, suffocating cloud of shame. They realized they had belittled a man who was light years ahead of them, a man who didn't need to shout to be powerful. They saw the Navy liaison treating Jack's workspace like a sacred site, and they finally understood the depth of their mistake. The mission was a success. The Ford's array was stabilized, and the miracle was credited to the senior chief who had been found in a coastal shipyard. But Jack didn't want the credit. As soon as the system was green, he closed the link. He didn't ask about medals or bonuses. He asked the captain if his son was safe. The Navy's car had picked up Noah, and the boy was currently eating ice cream at his grandmother's house, blissfully unaware that his father had just saved a nuclear carrier. Jack leaned back against the bulkhead, his eyes closed, finally allowing himself to breathe. When the helicopters returned Jack to the parking lot 2 hours later, the entire shipyard staff was waiting in a somber, respectful formation. The board members were there. Sterling was nowhere to be seen, having been escorted off the premises in his now ruined suit, and a crowd of workers stood in a line. They wanted to cheer. They wanted to apologize. But Jack didn't give them the chance. He hopped out of the bird, shook the captain's hand with a firm, silent nod, and walked straight to his truck. A board member tried to stop him. "Mr. Miller, Senior Chief, we'd like to offer you the director's position. We'll double your salary. We'll give you whatever you need." Jack paused, his hand on the truck door. He looked at the shipyard, the place where he had been humiliated only hours before. "I don't want the director's job," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the remaining hum of the engines. "I'm a technician. I like fixing things. If you want me to stay, fire the people who care more about their suits than their equipment. Otherwise, I'm just a dad who's very late for dinner." He drove away, leaving them with the silence of their own regrets. The ocean was dark by the time Jack reached his mother-in-law's house. The salt spray of the helicopters had been replaced by the soft glow of a suburban porch light. He walked inside, and the smell of home, laundry detergent, and wood smoke washed over him. Noah was on the couch, surrounded by Legos, looking up with a wide, tired grin that made everything else disappear. "Hey, Dad! Grandma said you had a really big job to do for the Navy," Noah said, running over to hug his father's waist. Jack picked him up, feeling the solid, real weight of his world. "Yeah, Noah. Just a quick fix. I'm sorry I was late." Noah looked at him, his eyes curious. "Did you have to fly a helicopter?" Jack smiled, kissing the top of his son's head. "I was just a passenger, buddy. I'm much better at being your dad than I am at flying." He sat on the floor, helping Noah build a Lego ship. His hands, the same hands that had guided a carrier back from the brink, now focused on tiny plastic bricks. Jack didn't return to the Navy, despite the Admiral's personal request and the promise of a desk at the Pentagon. He stayed at the shipyard, but under a new contract as the chief technical consultant. He worked his own hours. He wore the same worn-out vest. He didn't have a glass office, he had a workbench. But the culture of the yard had been permanently altered. The spreadsheet era was over, replaced by a renewed respect for the people who actually understood the machines. The workers now knew that the most important person in the room might be the one who says the least. Sterling was never heard from again in the engineering world. His KPIs hadn't saved him from the reality of his own arrogance. He became a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms across the coast. The shipyard became a place of listening, a place where a technician's intuition was valued as much as a manager's report. A young apprentice, inspired by Jack, stopped a massive turbine one afternoon because he heard a click. Instead of being fired, he was promoted. Jack watched from a distance, a small, proud smile on his face. He was healing the yard, one quiet lesson at a time, proving that true leadership is about serving, not commanding. The beach returned to its natural, quiet rhythm. The waves crashed against the docks, and the salt wind continued to blow. But there was a new sense of peace in the yard. The lesson remained etched in the minds of everyone who watched the sky that day. They learned that character isn't a title you wear. It's the silence you keep until the moment you're needed. Jack Miller remained the quiet guy, but he was no longer a shadow. He was the foundation. The narrator's voice concludes as the camera pans up from Jack and Noah sitting on the porch, looking at the distant sea under a canopy of stars. He was humiliated and fired. He walked out in silence. Because he knew that the world doesn't need more directors. It needs more fathers who aren't afraid to be ghosts. Until the sky called his name, and 2 Navy helicopters touched the earth to remind everyone that a hero doesn't need to shout to be heard. If you believe true power lies in character, comment Navy and subscribe to Daddy Healing Stories. Don't let the quiet heroes go unnoticed. Share this story with someone who needs to know their worth isn't defined by their title.